Soviet spy ships were watching from the edge of the zone, waiting for a piece of the wreckage to drift their way. The paranoia was high, but the real shock was waiting 100 feet below the surface.
We do have a target in front of us. Looks interesting on sonar.
A massive shadow appeared on the radar, sitting upright in the sand. It was the forward fuselage.
We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers.
Everyone's obsessed with the explosion. But the real story is the 2 minutes and 45 seconds that followed. The disturbing signature found by the divers proved that the crew did not just give up. They fought, and they were conscious for the entire, terrifying fall. Signals from the grave. The search for the Challenger was not just a recovery mission. It was a desperate hunt for answers in a hostile environment. The surface search was chaotic, with thousands of pounds of white debris floating on the waves. But the real target was deep below. The Navy had deployed a fleet of ships, submarines, and research vessels to scan the ocean floor. The search grid was enormous, covering nearly 500 square miles of shifting sand and deep currents. It was like trying to find a specific car parked in a parking lot the size of a state. Except the lights are off and the parking lot is underwater. For weeks, the sonar operators stared at their screens until their eyes burned. They were looking for contacts, any irregularity on the smooth bottom of the ocean. Most of the time it was nothing. A sunken refrigerator, an old oil drum, or a rock formation that looked like a wing. But here is the catch. The waters off Cape Canaveral were not empty. This was the height of the Cold War. While the Americans were searching for their lost shuttle, the Soviets were watching. There were reports of Russian fishing vessels sitting just outside the exclusion zone. These were not just fishermen. They were intelligence ships, bristling with antennas, listening to every radio frequency and watching the recovery efforts. The paranoia was real. The United States Navy had to divert resources just to keep an eye on the Russians. There was a genuine fear that if the Soviets got to the wreckage first, they could steal classified technology, or even worse, plant false evidence. The divers were not just fighting the elements. They were working in the shadow of a potential international incident. In early March, the rhythm of the search broke. The USS Preserver, a rescue and salvage ship, was running a side-scan sonar line in a sector that had been marked as low probability. The operator on duty was watching the display, a scrolling image of the seafloor built by sound waves. Suddenly, a signature appeared that made him sit up straight. It was not the jagged, scattered return of a debris field. Usually, when an aircraft hits the water at high speed, it shreds into tiny pieces. But this signal was different. It was a hard, solid return. It had sharp edges. It had geometry. The operator called the bridge. "Mark this contact," he said. The ship circled back, running the sonar over the spot again from a different angle. The image sharpened. It was a large object sitting heavily in the silt, partially music-covered, but unmistakably artificial. It was roughly 30 feet long. The room went quiet. The dimensions did not match the wings or the cargo bay doors. There was only one part of the shuttle that was that size and that shape. The crew knew what it was before anyone said it out loud. It was the crew compartment. But there was something disturbing about the signature. It was too intact. The shuttle had been torn apart by forces at 46,000 feet. Everyone had assumed the destruction was total. The popular belief was that the vehicle had been vaporized. But the shadow on the screen told a different story. It suggested that a massive piece of the ship had survived the fireball and the fall. And get this, if the compartment was intact, that meant the astronauts might have been inside it when it hit the water. The mood on the ship shifted from a technical search to a somber, terrifying realization. The commander ordered the divers to suit up. This was not going to be a standard salvage dive. This was going to be a descent into a tomb. The mystery of that solid signal was only the first step toward a much darker reality. Gravity's cruel grip. To really understand the horror of what the divers were about to find, we have to rewind the clock. we have to go back to the morning of January 28th. The official story is that a rubber seal failed because it was cold. That is the version in the history books. But it is not that simple. On the morning of the launch, Florida was experiencing a freak weather event. The temperatures had plunged deep into the 20s. The launch pad, usually a place of heat and steam, looked like an ice fortress. Massive icicles, some nearly a foot long, were hanging from the service structure. The safety team was worried that the ice would break off during liftoff and damage the heat tiles. But the real danger was invisible. Inside the massive white solid rocket boosters, the rubber O-rings that were supposed to seal the joints had turned into hard plastic. They had lost their ability to flex. The company that built the boosters knew this. Their engineers were frantic. They held a meeting with NASA the night before, begging them to delay. They said, "Do not launch." But NASA was under immense pressure. They were trying to prove that space travel could be like an airline. They had a teacher on board, and they wanted her lesson to be broadcast during the school day. The managers basically told the engineers to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats. Basically, the launch proceeded despite the warnings. At 73 seconds into the flight, the shuttle encountered strong wind shear. It was the strongest ever recorded. The vibration broke a temporary seal that had formed from burning fuel. A jet of flame like a blowtorch escaped from the side of the booster. It burned through the tank, and then the liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen mixed. What most people do not realize is that it was not an explosion in the traditional sense. It was a rapid breakup. The shuttle did not blow up like a bomb. It was torn apart by the wind because it was flying sideways at twice the speed of sound. Because it was a structural breakup, large pieces survived. The wings sheared off, the tail snapped, and the crew compartment, built to be the strongest part of the ship, ripped away. The cabin was flying free. At that moment, the 7 astronauts were still strapped in. The cockpit was hurtling upward, carried by momentum. It reached a peak altitude of about 65,000 feet before gravity grabbed it. Then it began to fall. This is the part that keeps engineers awake at night. The video footage shows the nose section emerging from the fireball, intact, trailing a web of wires. So, when the divers were looking at that sonar signature weeks later, they were looking at a vessel that had flown for 2 minutes and 45 seconds after the breakup. The question was no longer how the ship failed, but what happened during that long drop. The descent into the Atlantic is a journey into darkness. As the divers went deeper, the light from the surface faded into a dark blue and then to black. The depth was roughly 100 feet. Not deep enough to be the abyss, but deep enough to be deadly if you made a mistake. The currents were strong, tugging at the divers' gear. The silt on the bottom was fine and loose. When the lead diver's light finally hit the object, he froze. The sonar had not lied. It was a massive structure. It was sitting upright, banking slightly to one side in the sand. The white thermal tiles were scorched and missing in patches. Wires were floating around it like tentacles. It was the forward fuselage. The windows were the most haunting part. The thick glass was still there. Through the murky water, the divers could see into the flight deck. It was not empty. This discovery sent a shockwave through the recovery team. Finding the cabin largely intact meant that the forces in the air had not been enough to eliminate the crew. It meant the fall was the final blow. The divers had to work with extreme care. This was a grave site, but it was also a crime scene. They could not just hook a chain to it. They had to document everything. Where were the switches? What condition were the helmets in? Here is where the wild theories get some fuel. There were rumors among the salvage crews that the cabin was not found where it should have been. Some speculated that the cabin had flown further than predicted, suggesting the pilots might have had some control. During the recovery, there were unconfirmed reports of sonar contacts shadowing the Navy ships. The divers were constantly looking over their shoulders. Imagine being 100 feet underwater, working on a tomb, and worrying that a Russian minis might be watching you from the gloom. The tension was real. The United States Navy actually used small explosives to warn off unidentified objects in the area. Why would the Soviets be interested? Because the shuttle was the crown jewel of American engineering. If the Russians could grab a piece of the electronics, it would be a huge win for them. So the divers were racing against the clock. Surfacing from that dive changed them. They had seen the evidence that the end did not happen the way the public thought. When the cabin was finally lifted, water cascaded out of the windows. The crew on the deck stood in silence as the wreckage was covered with tarps. The physical wreckage was shocking, but the data inside was about to tell an even more disturbing story. Astronauts' final stand. Once the salt water was cleaned off the instrument panel, the investigators realized that 3 specific switches had been flipped. These were switches that could only be moved by a human hand after the breakup. This is the part of the story that was kept quiet for a long time. When the cockpit was analyzed, investigators looked at the personal egress air packs. These are emergency air supplies for astronauts. To activate them, you have to reach behind your head. 4 of the packs were recovered. 3 of them had been turned on. And get this, pilot Mike Smith's pack was turned on, but his pack was located in a spot he could not reach while strapped in. That means someone sitting behind him reached forward and turned his air on for him. This proves without a doubt that for at least several seconds after the shuttle broke apart, the crew was alive and conscious. They were trying to save each other. They were not vaporized. They were working the problem. The fall took 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Try to imagine that if the cabin held its pressure, they would have been awake for the entire fall. They would have seen the sky turn from black to blue. They would have heard the roar of the wind increasing as they accelerated. The disturbing signature found by the divers was the forensic proof of this nightmare. The switches showed intent. The air packs showed survival instinct. There is another theory regarding the stabilization system. It is believed the commander tried to engage systems that were no longer connected. The tragedy is that they were in a vessel with no way out. When the public found out about the activated air packs years later, it caused a firestorm. People felt lied to. Admitting that they fell while trying to fix the ship made the engineering failures feel even more heavy. The investigators also found that the pilot had moved several electrical switches to try and restore power. He was fighting until the very last second. This forensic evidence turned the disaster into a story of ultimate bravery. They did their jobs, even as the sky was falling. The truth found in the silt was a hard reality that no one was prepared to face. Ghostly reminders in the sand. Even decades later, the disaster is surrounded by a cloud of mystery that refuses to dissipate. As a culture, we are uncomfortable with the mundane nature of catastrophe. We want a complex plot to explain such a loss. Something that matches the cinematic scale of a fireball against a crisp blue Florida sky. We crave a villain with a face, a clandestine operation, or a celestial anomaly. The human mind seeks a narrative weight that balances the scales of the tragedy. Yet, the truth found at the bottom of the Atlantic was far heavier than any fiction. In the years following 1986, the vacuum of information was filled by a chorus of whispers. Some argued that the Challenger was never meant to return, that it carried a clandestine payload, a prototype for the Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative that had gone critically hot before it could be deployed. There were theories of Soviet interference of high-frequency pulses beamed from a trawler disguised as a fishing vessel, disrupting the delicate electronics of the solid rocket boosters. More fringe circles whispered about Project Blue Beam, suggesting the entire launch was a holographic ruse or a psychological experiment gone wrong. There were even claims of time slips where the shuttle hadn't exploded, but had been snatched by a gravitational anomaly, leaving only a decoy to perish in our atmosphere. These wild theories served a purpose. They acted as a psychological buffer. If the Challenger was taken by aliens or saboteurs, it was an act of war or a cosmic fluke. It meant the system wasn't broken, it was simply outmatched. The real conspiracy, however, was not aliens or lasers. It was far more terrifying because it was preventable. It was a room full of people in suits ignoring safety warnings because they did not want to delay a television broadcast. The conspiracy was the banality of the bureaucratic machine, a collective decision to privilege go for launch optics over the cold, hard data of physics. When the divers first descended into the murky depths off the coast, they weren't looking for myths. They were looking for the signature, the specific sonar profile of a machine that had been torn apart at Mach 1.9. The Atlantic at those depths is a graveyard of visibility. The silt rises like a fog, and the pressure sings in your ears like a low-frequency warning. The disturbing signature the divers found on their screens that day was not the result of a mid-air vaporization. It was the result of a meeting where safety was voted down. As they swam through the debris field, they didn't find the clean, melted edges of a laser strike. They found the jagged, twisted remains of a structure that had fought to stay together. The divers who touched that wreckage saw the reality of physics in its most brutal form. They saw metal that had been bent like paper and wires that had been charred not by an external weapon, but by the internal failure of a single rubber seal. They saw a machine that failed because of human pride. There is a specific kind of hubris that comes with conquering the heavens, a belief that the success path is the only path. The divers felt it in the weight of the wreckage. Every piece of tile they recovered was a testament to a warning ignored. They weren't just recovering hardware. They were recovering the physical evidence of a moral lapse. The room where gravity won. To understand the signature in the silt, one must look back at the night before the launch. The temperature at Cape Canaveral had plummeted. Icicles hung from the launch pad like frozen daggers. The engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractors responsible for the solid rocket boosters, were terrified. They knew the O-rings, music, the critical seals between the rocket segments, were not designed to function in such extreme cold. They knew the rubber would lose its memory, its ability to spring back and seal the gap against the inferno of the booster's interior. They told NASA. They pleaded for a delay, but the schedule was king. The Teacher in Space program was the crown jewel of the mission, and the State of the Union address was looming. The suits in the room didn't want to hear about the elasticity of rubber. They wanted to hear about the resilience of the American spirit. They pressured the engineers to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats. In that moment, music, the Challenger was destroyed. It didn't happen at 46,000 feet. It happened in a heated conference room. The signatures the divers would eventually find were written in ink on a flight readiness form before the engines even sparked. The silent descent. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the tragedy, and the part that fuel injected the wildest theories of the time, was the fate of the crew cabin. For years, the public was led to believe the explosion was instantaneous, a quick and painless end. But the divers found a different story. The crew compartment had remained largely intact after the initial breakup. It didn't explode. It was ejected. The reality found in the silt is that 7 brave people fought for their lives while falling from the stars. Evidence suggested that several of the personal egress air packs' peeps had been activated. The crew was conscious. They were plummeting through the atmosphere for nearly 3 minutes, trapped in a steel box, watching the ocean rush toward them. There were no aliens there to save them, and no secret government technology to teleport them away. There was only the sound of rushing air and the crushing realization that the system had failed them. The legacy of that dive is still with us today. It changed the way we searched the ocean, not just for debris, but for the truth. The technology the divers used, the side-scan sonar, the ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, and the precise GPS mapping paved the way for finding the Titanic and other lost relics of the deep. But more than technology, it gave us a new methodology of skepticism. It taught us that when a machine fails, we shouldn't look at the sky. We should look at the ledger. Today, the pieces of the Challenger are not in a museum. They are not displayed for the public to marvel at. They are buried in a decommissioned missile silo at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, specifically at Launch Complex 31 and 32. After the investigation, the thousands of pounds of debris were lowered into the abandoned shafts and sealed in concrete. It is treated like a sacred tomb. There is something deeply symbolic about burying a spacecraft in a missile silo. a machine designed to touch the stars, ending its journey in a hole meant for nuclear war. The concrete seal is a physical manifestation of our desire to contain the failure, to keep the ghosts of 1986 from wandering. The debris is not just metal. It is a repository of a lesson we keep trying to forget. Every now and then, however, the ocean reminds us. A piece of the heat shield or a fragment of the wing washes up on a Florida beach encrusted in barnacles, a ghostly reminder of a winter morning decades ago. Each piece that surfaces is a crack in the concrete tomb. It forces us to look again at the signature found by those divers. The truth of the Challenger is less spectacular than a conspiracy theory, but far more profound. It is the story of the normalization of deviance, a term coined by sociologist Diane Vaughan. It is the process where people become so accustomed to a risky behavior that they no longer see it as deviant. The O-rings had shown Blowbee's soot on previous missions, and because nothing had exploded yet, the management assumed it was a calculated risk. The signature on the screen that day was a warning. It told us that space is hard and we are fragile. It told us that no amount of political pressure can change the freezing point of rubber or the laws of thermodynamics. The divers who pulled the wreckage from the silt weren't just doing a job. They were performing an autopsy on an era of blind optimism. Does knowing they were conscious make their legacy more heroic or more tragic? Let me know your thoughts below. Make sure to like the video and subscribe for more mysteries. See you in the next one.